What's the easiest choice you can make? Window instead of middle seat? Picking a vendor who sends a great gift basket? Outsourcing business tasks you hate? What about selling with Shopify? Whether you're selling a little or a lot, Shopify helps you do your thing, however you cha-ching. Shopify is the global commerce platform that helps you sell at every stage of your business. From the launch your online shop stage to the first real-life store stage, all the way to the did we just hit a million orders stage. Shopify's there to help you grow. Whether you're selling scented soap or offering outdoor outfits, Shopify helps you sell. Wherever and whatever you're selling, Shopify's got you covered. Sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/try. Go to shopify.com/try now to grow your business, no matter what stage you're in. Shopify.com/try.
You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
Hello out there in Archaeology Podcast land. This is Dr. Alan Garfinkel. I'm the president and founder of the California Rock Art Foundation. And what we do is we identify, evaluate, manage, and conserve rock art both in Alta California and in Baja California. We conduct field trips, we have trainings, exercise, we do research, and in every way possible, we try to preserve, protect, and coordinate treasures of Alta and Baja California rock art, of which there are many and diverse. We also work closely with Native Americans and partner with them to recognize and protect sacred sites. So for more info about the fabulous California Rock Art Foundation, you can go to carockart.org. Also, I'm open to give me a call, 805-312-2261. We would welcome sponsorship or underwriting, helping us to defray the costs of our podcasts, and also membership in California Rock Art Foundation. And of course, donations, since we are a 501c3 nonprofit scientific and educational corporation. God bless everyone out there in podcast land.
You're listening to the Rock Art Podcast. Join us every week for fascinating tales of rock art, adventure, and archaeology. Find our contact info in the show notes and send us your suggestions.
Hey out there in Archaeology Podcast land. This is Dr. Alan Garfinkel for episode 99. We've got Meinrat Andreae, goes by Andy, a biogeochemist who's worked all over the world in dating rock art. You won't want to miss this one. He's a genius and has been published in several different scientific journals, and his means of dating rock art has been working. Hello out there in Archaeology Podcast land. This is Dr. Alan Garfinkel, your host for the 99th episode of the Rock Art Podcast. And we are really blessed and honored to have Meinrat Andreae, who goes by Andy, a biogeochemist, director of the Max Planck Institute for Chemistry in Mainz, a review editor of the Journal of Science, a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and he and his associates have published more than 500 articles and books in scientific journals. And he tells me that Wikipedia effort is probably out of date. Is that correct, Andy?
Yes, I think it is. I actually haven't looked at it myself for quite a while.
Andy and I met when he and I did a bit of research on the Coso rock art there in the Western Mojave Desert. Andy was kind enough to spend quite a bit of time with us and do some dates, and we'll get to that one probably in the second segment. But Andy, I'd like you to spend a little bit of time giving people a soundbite about your background and your interests and how you thread the needle, per se, and got out to the study of dating of rock art, which is quite a remarkable subject.
Well, yeah, I don't quite know how far to go back, but, in fact, when I was just finishing high school, I had to decide whether I was going to do one of my favorite things, and that is going into anthropology, ethnography, or another one, which is going into chemistry. And I guess eventually I decided chemistry had sort of, better career prospects, and ended up going into chemistry. And then since living and working in a lab all the time really didn't satisfy me so much, I ended up going into geochemistry and studied hard rocks in Norway. And then eventually moved on to soft rocks, to seawater, to the atmosphere. And one of my field trips actually ended up in the California desert, and I saw all this black stuff that was coating the rocks out there. And that sort of puzzled me at the time. Well, this rock varnish, desert varnish stuff, where does that come from? How does that form? And that's a question that I actually first asked myself sort of in the mid-1970s. Then pretty much forgot about it until I read an article 10 or so years ago about the biological involvement in forming this rock varnish. So I thought, that's an interesting topic. So I started to look at the geochemistry and the biogeochemistry of rock varnish. Now, how did I get into the anthropology, archaeology part of it? Well, I thought, naive geochemist that I am, that the archaeologists would know how old rock art is, and I was interested in the question of how fast does desert varnish form. So, what's the idea? I go and find rock art someplace, I measure the amount of varnish on there, and then ask the archaeologist how old is that rock art, and then, I can calculate how fast the varnish forms. It so turned out I had, overestimated the archaeologists, because the first question they asked me is, we don't know how old that stuff is, but we'd like you to tell us with all your beautiful measurements. And, so that's how I ended up working for, by now, probably about a decade on trying to figure out how to make measurements on rock art and how to actually come up with estimates for the age of that rock art.
Now, you began your studies in the Middle East, did you? In Saudi Arabia?
Yeah, I first worked in Saudi Arabia, and the great advantage there for my purposes was that there, in the desert of Saudi Arabia, you find a lot of inscriptions. So people in the Middle East were pretty much the first to develop writing, and they applied this writing to all sorts of things, like to mud, clay, bricks, and so on, and developed one of the first styles of writing there. But they also wrote on rock, and they did this in the same way that other rock artists created. They scraped off or picked off the rock varnish, and then they had light on dark inscriptions. And the nice thing is they started to do that, some 2,500 to maybe 3,000 years ago. And they used different styles of writing, different alphabets. And the epigraphers, the people who study inscriptions and writings, the epigraphers had a fairly good idea as to what styles were used when. So there is all these things called Hismaic and Saphaitic and Datanitic and so on, different styles of writing. So if I made measurements on those things, actually then I could get an idea as to, knowing how old they are, knowing how much new rock varnish has formed on these inscriptions, then I could get an idea as to how fast that varnish forms. The other nice thing about working in Arabia is that there's been some really sharp climatic transitions. There was something called an Arabian humid period, which ended about 5,000 years ago. During that humid period, there was enough rainfall in Arabia that water was pretty much reliably available, and that enabled people to hold cattle. Because cattle, actually, they need to drink basically pretty much once a day or at least every other day. And so in inscriptions that date back to the humid, or rock art that dates back to the humid period, you do see cattle. And then about 5,000 years ago, the cattle disappear from the rock art. And what we'll find then is the domesticated camel, because that's a dry adapted animal. And so we use these sort of transitions in the ecology and in human activities, as well as inscriptions to give you a fairly good idea as to markers, how old things are, and then from that you derive the rate at which the varnish accumulates, and then knowing that rate, you can then start to date things that don't have any identifying things like climate transitions or writing. You can then date things like humans that are seen in beautiful dancing scenes from about 10,000 years ago, the early Holocene, pre-Neolithic figures, down to horseman scenes that are maybe about 1,000 years old in the Arabian desert.
Pretty amazing. Tell us a bit about what rock varnish is and what you've learned about the nature of how it's formed. I believe it's still somewhat of a controversial subject, and I know I've read extensively about it, but what do we think we know about how this desert varnish is accumulated, principally on sandstone and also on volcanic rocks, I would presume, although I have seen it on granite as well.
Yeah, I mean, rock varnish, or desert varnish, some people call it, or rock varnish, pretty much can form on almost any surface that's resistant enough to weathering to stick around for thousands or tens of thousands of years. And so basalt is a very good substrate. It forms nicely on basalt. It just also forms on granite, lots of granites, gneisses. It doesn't like to form on carbonate rocks because they tend to dissolve too rapidly. So on limestones, typically you don't find it. People have argued a long time about how it forms. So first, what is it? Well, it's a visually dark, blackish, dark brown, thin layer of a mixture of clay minerals, manganese oxides, iron oxides, the occasional quartz grain. The way it forms now is that actually dust settles on a rock surface, and that dust contains, just like any other rock or material on the Earth's surface, contains elements including manganese. And manganese is kind of an interesting element because it can exist in many different chemical forms. There's one form which is called manganese 2, and that's quite a soluble material. This manganese 2 can be oxidized to manganese 4, which is very insoluble. So you can think about the same way kind of as iron. You can have iron as a metal. You can dissolve that iron like in acid, and then it's soluble. But if you take that iron and let it oxidize to form basically rust, then it becomes very insoluble, and then it coats the surface. And so in a way, it's akin to rust formation. The manganese gets extracted by solutions, by a little bit of moisture that's on the rock and coats the dust, gets extracted, and then it becomes oxidized and reprecipitates. And so it's, as I say, it's the manganese equivalent to iron rust. So how does it form? Well, the dust settles on the rock, then comes some humidity, which gets deposited from a little bit of rain, a little bit of dew, and extracts the manganese. It gets exposed to the air, gets oxidized, and then the manganese oxides that precipitate, they just bind together as a cement of some of the dust, some of the mineral grains, some of the clay minerals, and form this thin layer on the rock, which is about of the order of a human hair, or the thickness of maybe 10 times the thickness of a human hair, that sort of order of magnitude. And it forms a nice, dark, shiny coating that you can see a lot when you go out into the desert, both on boulders on the ground and also on rock outcrops, vertical surfaces. And that makes sort of a canvas for an artist, a Stone Age artist, who then can inscribe basically into this rock varnish his writing or his art figures.
What I believe I've seen throughout the California desert and other places throughout the Great Basin, but mainly in California, is the substratum is basalt. And of course, this desert varnish has a gray or blue or even black tenor to it. And what happens is they use some sort of a pick, some sort of a quartz pick to penetrate the varnish to expose the heart rock, which is the light heart rock that's unvarnished. And then this appears as the elements or the particular incisions that are produced on the canvas and is the basis for the art forms or the writing or the engravings that occur. Am I correct?
Yes, exactly. This can be done in a number of different ways. It can be done by basically direct incision. So the guy just takes a sharp rock and starts picking away directly on the substrate, on the surface that he wants to put the rock art onto. Well, I'm saying he because we assume that most of rock artists may have been men, but we don't actually know that. And given the fact that there is also female shamans, and it may well have been that, and shamans have been implicated in creation of rock art, so it may well be that there's also female rock artists. But anyway, our rock artist can do this by basically the direct percussion, directly hitting the rock surface with a sharp rock chisel, or to make more sophisticated rock art, he can take one sharp chisel and another hammerstone, put the chisel onto his rock surface, and then pound on the back of it with the hammerstone, which allows much more control. Other methods are actually, which works well on sandstone, are taking a chisel and basically scrape or grind off larger surfaces. So there are a number of techniques that have been used to clear the varnish off of the rock substrate.
Andy, let's stop there. And in the next one, I think we'll dive a little deeper into some of the research that you've published, dating rock art in 4 different publications. See you in the flip-flop, gang.
When you need mealtime inspiration, it's worth shopping Baker's, where you'll find over 30,000 mouth-watering choices that excite your inner foodie. And no matter what tasty choice you make, you'll enjoy our everyday low prices, plus extra ways to save, like digital coupons worth over $600 each week. You can also save up to $1 off per gallon at the pump with fuel points. More savings and more inspiring flavors make shopping Baker's worth it every time. Baker's, fresh for everyone. Fuel restrictions apply.
Well, welcome back, everybody. We're really blessed and honored to have Andy with us, Meinrat Andreae, who's a biogeochemist, and he's the gentleman who's been pioneering the XRF method of dating rock art throughout the world. And Andy, are you with us?
Yes, I am.
So let's open it up in this second segment and get to some of the nuts and bolts. People tell us that rock art is nearly impossible to date. And they also tell us that many of the methods that have been attempted are in fact controversial and subject to some tremendous problems and scrutiny. Do you agree with that or no?
Well, I think there's a number of methods, as you say, and I think they have strengths and weaknesses. I think with any of those methods, it's very easy to produce wrong results. But I think they all have some merit. Of course, rock art, well, some rock art actually contains carbon that one could in principle use to make carbon-14 age measurements. And that is more or less sort of the gold standard for actually determining ages in the sort of range to which it's applicable to, something like 50,000 years. In order for that to be valid, you have to have carbon which is actually directly connected to the rock art that you're studying. And as I say, with some kinds of rock art, pictographs, which are like painted onto rock, there may be organic binders or charcoal that they've been using, and that then can be reasonably well related to the actual age, to the time of creation. So presumably, if somebody has taken, for instance, charcoal to draw on rock and create pictographs that way, presumably that charcoal is contemporary with the artist, more or less, and thus it actually would reflect the date of rock art creation.
Right. What we're talking about here, for the most part, are rock drawings, or what we call petroglyphs.
Right.
And unfortunately, when we do rock drawings and petroglyphs, those are lacking in the organics that typically are needed to do any sort of radiocarbon dating.
Yeah, I mean, some petroglyphs appear to include some fragments of organic matter under the newly formed rock varnish, and that has been used, but has been also very controversial. Ron Dorn took measurements along those lines, and there's been a huge mess in the literature about whether those things were valid or not, or all sorts of dark accusations have been made. But that aside, the creation of rock art petroglyphs consists in the removal of something. And so if you remove something, then, well, that makes it difficult to actually come up with a date. So people have been using weathering processes, like the rate at which the sharp edges on the minerals that are in behind the rock art, so to speak, which those sharp edges become rounded again by weathering. That's been maybe a useful method in some instances, but it's quite difficult to calibrate. People have been using other approaches, such as layering of inside rock varnish that has been newly formed. There is a gentleman named Yu who has been using that successfully. But the problem with most of those things is that A, they're difficult to calibrate, and B, many of them require actually removal of samples, and that's just not something that's very popular in archaeology, because you really don't want to start scraping away material from this precious rock art.
Yeah, you don't want to be a destructive method. So what helps us with your method and others that's non-destructive is to use some sort of a portable XRF machine that we can quantitatively measure the trace elements that exist in the rock varnish. Am I correct?
Right, yeah. I mean, there's this wonderful instrument called a Portable X-ray Fluorescence Analyzer, or PXRF, and that you can sort of visualize like something like a little bit heavy hairdryer. It's got about the size and shape of a hairdryer. It weighs a little bit more than that. And so that's easily portable into the field. It's battery operated, so you can pretty much, with a couple of batteries, operate it for a whole day. And all you really need to do to make a measurement is you take this thing and hold it against whatever you want to measure, the rock surface, the petroglyph, and press the trigger for something like 30 seconds to maybe 2 minutes or so, and then you have a measurement. And so it's very easy within 1 day or so to make 100 measurements. And so that's another great advantage of this method is you can get a lot of data. And with a lot of data, you can do statistics. And any error that may be involved in a single measurement can be either identified by being a statistical outlier or averaged over if you make a whole lot of measurements.
So what we're measuring, what we're looking for, is we take our machine and look in the interstices, if that's the right word. We're looking for a spot where we can get a clean measurement within the glyph itself, correct?
Right, yeah. I mean, the spot size of this instrument is 8 millimeters. What's that, a third of an inch for those who think in inch units. And you can actually narrow it down to 3 millimeters, but typically the best measurements you get with the 8 millimeter spot size. So all you need to do is basically you look at your rock art element, your antelope or your desert bighorn that's been depicted, and then you find a spot that's at least 8 millimeter in size, and then you make a measurement. And what you measure is actually the concentration of manganese, because manganese is sort of the diagnostic element for rock varnish. And you do this ideally within 3, 4, 5 spots within the same rock art, same petroglyph, the same rock art element. And also you make the same kind of measurements in the untouched, in the intact rock varnish that's surrounding your petroglyph. And then from the ratio between what you measure on the petroglyph itself and in the surrounding intact virgin desert varnish, rock varnish, from that ratio you can then get an idea as to how long that petroglyph has been sitting there exposed to the formation of fresh new varnish on its surface.
So we need some means to calibrate it, don't we? We need some sort of measure to understand what that ratio might mean chronologically, correct?
Exactly, and that's the most difficult part really of this whole approach. You need calibration surfaces, and as I pointed out before, in Saudi Arabia, we were very lucky because people have made these datable inscriptions. And in North America, that's much more difficult because there's no writing. People have not developed writing there. Native people have not developed writing in North America. So we don't have inscriptions that have datable types of scripts. But there are other things. There are transitions like that from the atlatl and spear to the bow and arrow, which happened some 1,500, 2,000 years ago. There are also at other sites particular kinds of sandals that the Native Americans wore and that show up in rock art. And those sort of things, again, give you time markers that you can use to determine the rate of new formation, reformation of varnish on the petroglyphs, and thus again develop a measurement of the rate at which varnish accumulates. And once you know that rate, then you can determine the age of unknown petroglyph surfaces. So in other words, if you know that X amount of manganese forms over 1,000 years, then if you measure 2 or 3 times that amount on a petroglyph, you know that it must be about 2,000-3,000 years old.
Yes. And so we have the changes in technology. We've got the use of the atlatl. We've got the bow and arrow depicted. We also have some historic glyphs that will give us some sort of contact date.
Right.
And we try to sort of look at the superimposition or the way in which we expect to see the different images and how they are depicted.
Right.
I've just published a little booklet, a small book on the depiction of projectile points that exist in the Koso rock art. And those projectile points are a specific style of rock art, and they date to the Middle Archaic. And so we can use those as sort of an anchor as well, which would be a further interest, certainly, because we have some sort of a diagnostic.
Yeah, and in fact, on one of the most recent site that I worked on in North America, which is in northern Utah, we also used a particular style of projectile point as a time marker. So that's quite useful if you have identifiable objects such as projectile points with a specific outline.
Do you remember what projectile point form it was and what the age was generally for that form?
I can't actually tell you right now off the top of my head.
Yeah.
I'll have to look that up.
Yeah, I'm going to have to look at that too. That would be interesting. Yeah. It appears that there's a prominence. There's only a particular time in prehistory, and it seems to be rather consistent that throughout the Americas, there was what was called a fluorescence in what some researchers call a hunting religion. And that just existed in the Middle Archaic from about 2000 BC to about AD 1. And that's sort of the dating on many of these projectile point images. So it's just interesting to think about and to see how that all ferrets out. So you were saying the Odyssey here, you began doing this in the Middle East, correct?
That's right, yeah.
And how did that go? What did you learn? What did you discover? How was your technique refined? And how did this whole research position or research project develop?
Well, I had a collaboration actually with colleagues in Saudi Arabia before, when I was still not really thinking about rock art, and but I wanted to go to places in Saudi Arabia where I could surely find good developed desert varnish to make measurements on the geochemical aspects of it. We were also interested in seeing whether we could find any evidence for the involvement of microbes in the formation of the desert varnish. So I thought, well, having not been in Saudi Arabia before and not really knowing where to go, how can I go to a place where I for sure find desert varnish? And I read some articles about Saudi Arabia, and so then I stumbled on rock art there. I said, well, yeah, I mean, that's for sure a place where I find desert varnish, because I can see all those pictures of rock art carved into desert varnish. So I said, okay, well, for my first field trip to Saudi Arabia, I just go to this place in the middle of sort of central Saudi Arabia, where all these pictures were made showing rock art surrounded by good rock varnish. And then I went there and was just totally fascinated by what I actually saw in the rock art. There were some scenes where you saw men in lines sort of dancing. There were other scenes where you saw lots of camels. There were various kinds of animals, a kind of a goat species. It's very abundant there. And I thought, well, maybe I should actually focus more on the rock art. And I was, as I mentioned before, I was kind of hopeful that the archaeologists would be able to tell me the ages of this rock art. I saw that the guys that were dancing, they were covered with varnish that was almost completely as dark as the surroundings, and the camels were a lot lighter colored, and some of the ibexes, this wild desert goat, sort of seemed to range all through the different kinds of rock varnish thickness, suggesting that people have been depicting ibexes from the pre-Neolithic basically up to yesterday. Sort of in a similar way, like you see bighorn sheep in North America, which also go from the beginning of the Holocene 10,000 years ago to very, very recent. So that's one thing as an aside, that people apparently like to depict these sort of game animals, fancy game animals. Anywhere in the world, you see fancy game animals depicted in the rock art in northernmost Scandinavia, way north of the polar circle. Anyway, I was just fascinated by the rock art, and then decided to actually make a project out of it.
Let's hold it there, and we'll pick it up on the next segment. Thanks, gang. See you in the flip-flop.
What's the easiest choice you can make? Window instead of middle seat? Picking a vendor who sends a great gift basket? Outsourcing business tasks you hate? What about selling with Shopify? Whether you're selling a little or a lot, Shopify helps you do your thing, however you cha-ching. Shopify is the global commerce platform that helps you sell at every stage of your business. From the launch your online shop stage to the first real-life store stage, all the way to the did we just hit 1 million orders stage. Shopify's there to help you grow. Whether you're selling scented soap or offering outdoor outfits, Shopify helps you sell. Wherever and whatever you're selling, Shopify's got you covered. Sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/try. Go to shopify.com/try now to grow your business, no matter what stage you're in. Shopify.com/try.
When you need mealtime inspiration, it's worth shopping Baker's, where you'll find over 30,000 mouth-watering choices that excite your inner foodie. And no matter what tasty choice you make, you'll enjoy our everyday low prices, plus extra ways to save, like digital coupons worth over $600 each week. You can also save up to $1 off per gallon at the pump with fuel points. More savings and more inspiring flavors make shopping Baker's worth it every time. Baker's, fresh for everyone. Fuel restrictions apply.
Welcome back to episode 99. We've almost hit the 100 mark. This is your host, Dr. Alan Garfinkel for the Rock Art Podcast on the Archaeology Podcast Network. And we are absolutely glorious that Meinrat Andreae has given us the time on his busy schedule as a biogeochemist to talk about his adventures in rock art dating. Andy, so let's continue to talk about your experiences in Saudi Arabia when you began this research project.
Well, I mentioned this site in central Saudi Arabia, the region near a city called Ha'il. The fascination that I had with the incredible range of things depicted and the incredible time periods that were covered. As I mentioned, these dancers that we saw that were very ancient, they must have been carved into rock in the early part of the Holocene in the pre-Neolithic period. So that would be something like 9,000 years ago. It's actually quite amazing, the artistic skill of these pre-Neolithic artists. It shouldn't surprise us too much that people even that long ago had great artistic skills. We just have to think of the cave paintings in France. But these people actually managed to use a somewhat more difficult material, the rock surface, to create this fascinating art. I've then gone to a number of other places in Saudi Arabia where maybe the rock art is not quite as old, but incredibly skillfully done as well. We went to a place called Najran, the southernmost Saudi Arabia, to see both from my geochemist's point of view, if there was anything different in the way the composition of the varnish was at that site and in the rate at which the varnish formed, found a wonderful assembly of human figures, female dancers that were created probably about 5,000 years ago to 5,000 to 3,000 years ago. And then conversely, I ended up going to the very northernmost part of Saudi Arabia, just a few kilometers south of the border with Jordan. And again, for a whole different set of imagery, again, going back to the earliest part of the Holocene, again, ages of 9,000 years or so, and spanning through the entire history of pre-Islamic and going into Islamic Arabia, images that were created in maybe something like 1,000 years to 500 years ago. And interestingly enough, there was a pre-Islamic monastery in that region that existed probably about AD 400, roughly in that period. And the monks in this monastery carved crosses and other religious symbols into the sides of one of the little mountains, little hills there. And they could be dated, again, to that period of about 400 AD. So that's one of the really fascinating things, I think, about studying rock art and dating rock art, is that if you go to a given site, you actually find that rock art at the same place has been created over up to 10,000 years or so, more or less continuously, by different people who have come and gone and who must have all had some sense that there was something special about this place and expressed that sense by creating rock art.
What was the most exciting discovery that you've made in your research so far?
Most exciting, of course, is always really difficult, but something that just stunned me on my last trip to Saudi last year was, again, the skill of rock artists. This field site is sort of in the southwest of Saudi Arabia, on top of a hill, and what you find there is extremely intricately carved depictions of several birds in three-dimensional detail, and as well as ram's heads, again, in extremely sophisticated styling. And dating that material comes up with something like 6,000 to 8,000 years ago.
Amazing, huh?
So there were these carvers that were eminently skillful and created this rock art at a time when we thought that, there must have been some very primitive people in the region, but no, they were not. They were extremely skilled artists. And I think that's really what strikes me the most about studying rock art, is just how skilled people were at the time when all they had was stone tools, and agriculture hadn't been invented yet, but yet these people were very skillful.
So you've been most impressed with some of the sophistication and the beauty and the aesthetics of this imagery that is very early. These are pre-literate people living a very challenging environment, and one that they had the wherewithal and sophistication to produce these images that were absolutely extraordinarily beautiful.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, again, also in North America, you find extremely impressive images. I remember from one area in Wyoming. Yes, sometimes I've been working so many areas that sometimes I have to really think about where is actually something that I've seen in Wyoming, where there's just a fascinating kind of depictions there that can rival any modern art that you may see in a museum today.
What did you find in Wyoming?
Oh, there is a number of depictions of strange human-like beings that have very bizarre shapes, strange heads with strange protuberances coming out of the heads, just very magical figures, especially if you look at them in dim light, like at night after dark, and just imagine you sitting there with a fire and just see all these things in the flickering light of that fire. Must be just extremely striking, if not inducing awe and fear.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How old were those figures?
They're about of the order of 3,000 to 4,000 years.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we don't even know who created them, because actually the people that were there didn't leave any clear archaeological marks or so. So it's just prehistoric people, and they're North American natives that live in the same area nowadays don't actually know or don't relate to these images. They say, well, they're sacred things, but they don't have any direct connection anymore in terms of oral traditions or so to that particular art.
So let's jump to the COSO work, and then we'll talk at the end of our interaction about some of the future work that you're going to be doing. So you and I spent about a day working in the COSOs, didn't we?
Yes.
I think we were impressed with the cross-correlation between the archaeological evidence and the estimations of what we had known or thought we knew about the age of those images and the resulting dates that you were able to engineer. Yeah. And I think that some of the things that were striking to me, or the discoveries, was that we actually did demonstrate some of even the most recent milling slicks that were sometimes even superimposed over rock art were rather recent. And we even found images that went back 10,000 years. Was that correct?
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly what I was trying to refer to before also, is that these sites just have an incredible time depth. You have, on the same spot, you have something that's 10,000 years old, and then 10 meters away, something that's been created just very recently. I mean, these slicks, actually what was interesting about them was that they had a defined age. So sometimes what we find is that recent vandalism actually creates a surface with no detectable manganese, no detectable varnish. But these surfaces actually had an age that was somewhere probably about 400 years, around that time. And so they were definitely made by prehistoric people, but by very recent prehistoric people. So again, those measurements that we made at Little Lake, which is the site that you're referring to, they show that just a long occupation going back, times that are really almost impossible to sort of wrap your head around. What's 10,000 years? I mean, we sort of think in terms of years and decades or centuries or something like that. But something like 10,000 years and people coming and going in the same place over thousands and thousands of years and using that site for purposes, religious purposes, hunting, living, becomes even hard to imagine how many different people, how many different tribes, populations have been in that place, and leaving behind rock art that allows us actually to see that they were there, and in a certain sense to see what they were thinking about, because they carved things such as bighorn sheep, which we can still relate to and which make us puzzled. Why did they actually depict bighorn sheep? Was it because they thought making those images would help their hunting? Was it because they were markings of tribal identity? People are guessing, but it's very difficult to actually distinguish between those possibilities.
Absolutely. And there's probably many, many reasons over the course of thousands of years that those images were produced,
right,
for various times and settings. But overall, when we worked on the COSO issue, what was impressive to me was that we could see the evolution and the changes in land use, the cultural replacements, the shifts in settlement, site function, etc., could all be seen looking at the way those sites were dated, the images were dated, and the actual subject matter. And I always like that the rock art is unusual because it really is a window into the minds and the sensitivities and the passions of the people that were living there.
Right.
In one way, I think rock art is some of the most informative data sets that we can have in terms of archaeology, because it gives us a sense of the people,
right,
who they were and what they cared about. Did you get that sense when you've been working on these projects?
Yeah, definitely. And that's, as you say, that's a unique thing really about rock art, which you don't get from lithic remains or something like that, an arrow point or something like that. Yes, you know that it was a hunting or fighting weapon, but rock art really, in the same way that art is used now, is just something about some way that people express their mind, their soul, their ideals. And that's really the unique thing. And that's what keeps me fascinated about it.
Absolutely. We only have about a minute or two, Andy. Perhaps talk about where you're going to headed next and where your research is going.
Yeah, my next site that I'm going to be working on is again in Saudi Arabia. It's an area called Al Ula. And the fantastic thing about it is it's an incredibly rich amount of inscriptions there, which again are going to help me in calibrating my age metering, my rate of Varnish formation. In addition to again, a very rich amount of rock art. So I'm just going there now for a few days to make like a survey, photographic survey, to map out the places that I want to go back and study in detail, probably this fall. And the interesting thing also about this area is a very different time window. It flourished sort of around the time of about 1000 BC up into the period of Islam. And so that's a time period that I haven't been looking at so much in detail before, and that's really well represented there. There's also fascinating tombs that are similar to the famous Petra site in Jordan, which were created in the time of the Nabateans, about more or less about 0 AD. So I'm really looking forward to that project because it's going to show me something that's unique and new and that I haven't been working on before.
Andy, that's about all the time we have. I really want to thank you for your time and your effort, and I think you've produced some remarkable contributions that help us to date rock art. And thank you for your time, and it was a blessing and an honor to have you on the Rock Art podcast today.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed our conversation and look forward to future interactions and maybe future collaboration with you again.
Pleasure. Well, God bless you all out there in Archaeology podcast land, and see you on the flip-flop in a couple of weeks.
Thanks for listening to the Rock Art Podcast with Dr. Alan Garfinkel and Chris Webster. Find show notes and contact information at www.archpodnet.com/rockart. Thanks for listening, and thanks for sharing this podcast with your family and friends. This episode was produced by Chris Webster from his RV traveling the United States, Tristan Boyle in Scotland, DigTech LLC, Cultural Media, and the Archaeology Podcast Network, and was edited by Chris Webster.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.
What's the easiest choice you can make? Window instead of middle seat? Picking a vendor who sends a great gift basket? Outsourcing business tasks you hate? What about selling with Shopify? Whether you're selling a little or a lot, Shopify helps you do your thing, however you cha-ching. Shopify is the global commerce platform that helps you sell at every stage of your business. From the launch your online shop stage to the first real-life store stage, all the way to the did we just hit 1 million orders stage. Shopify's there to help you grow. Whether you're selling scented soap or offering outdoor outfits, Shopify helps you sell. Wherever and whatever you're selling, Shopify's got you covered. Sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/try. Go to shopify.com/try now to grow your business, no matter what stage you're in. Shopify.com/try.
When you need mealtime inspiration, it's worth shopping Baker's, where you'll find over 30,000 mouth-watering choices that excite your inner foodie. And no matter what tasty choice you make, you'll enjoy our everyday low prices, plus extra ways to save, like digital coupons worth over $600 each week. You can also save up to $1 off per gallon at the pump with fuel points. More savings and more inspiring flavors make shopping Baker's worth it every time. Baker's, fresh for everyone. Fuel restrictions apply.
.com.